It started with a sound I couldn't explain. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in my thickest blanket, watching snow drift outside the living room window. The wind howled in short, sharp bursts like it was warning something or someone to stay away. The house was older than I cared to admit. Built in the early 1900s, its bones creaked under the weight of winter and time, but that night the creaking felt different. It wasn't the casual groan of age. It was rhythmic, repetitive, deliberate. Thud, then silence. Thud, then again. A beat, like footsteps, but heavier somehow, as if someone were dragging their feet, heel first, across the wood. I muted the TV, the room filled with the muffled hum of the wind and the low ticking of the clock above the mantel. I strained to hear it again. Nothing. Just the usual silence of winter pressing against the walls. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was the pipes or the heating ducts expanding in the cold. But something about it stuck with me like a splinter in my thoughts. An hour later it returned, louder this time, coming from directly beneath the living room floor. And with it, I swear I heard something. A whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, like breath behind words. A slow, dragging murmur. I leaned down from the couch and pressed my ear to the floor. There was definitely something moving down. Not mice or raccoons, something bigger, something that was speaking. I jolted up so fast I nearly pulled the blanket with me. I wanted to laugh at myself, but I couldn't. My skin was crawling. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a flashlight, then made my way down to the basement. The air grew colder with every step, as if something down there had sucked all the warmth from the house. The light flickered as I reached the bottom. Shadows stretched long and crooked across the damp stone walls. The basement had always made me uneasy, even during daylight. It was unfinished, just dirt and concrete and wooden beams holding everything up. There were old tools rusting on the shelves, cobwebs in the corners, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment, like the house itself had forgotten about this place. I followed the beam of light toward the far side of the basement, where the floorboards above creaked earlier. There, beneath the living room, I noticed something strange, an uneven section of dirt, slightly raised, as if something had been recently buried or dug up. I stared at it for a long moment, then reached down and brushed the dirt aside. A wooden hatch, small, old, almost like a trapdoor. My heart stuttered. I didn't remember this being. I'd lived in this house for over a year, and I'd never seen anything like it. With trembling fingers, I pried it open. A gust of bitter cold air hit my face. The flashlight flickered again, but I managed to steady it. Beneath the hatch was a narrow tunnel, no more than 3 feet wide, crawling into darkness beneath the house. Wooden boards framed the walls. The air inside smelled ancient and wet, like rot and forgotten things. I didn't want to go in. Every fiber of my body screamed not to, but I couldn't stop myself. I climbed down. The tunnel was tight and damp. The deeper I went, the more I heard it. Whispers, rising and falling like breathless chanting. I couldn't make out the words. They weren't in a language I knew, but they sounded old, desperate, hungry. The path twisted, then opened into a small room carved directly into the earth. My flashlight swept across something etched into the dirt walls. Symbols, crude and jagged, scratched in over and over again, some of them dripping black resin, still fresh. In the center of the room was a circle of bone, human bone, arranged in a spiral pattern, all pointing inward toward a wooden box. I don't know why I opened it. Inside was a face. Not a severed head, not exactly. It looked mummified, its skin dark and pulled tight over bone, lips parted in a half scream, eyes stitched shut with red thread. And on the inside of the box's lid, words, scrawled in a language that made my eyes ache just to look at. My flashlight flickered violently. The whispers rose to a screech. Then, silence. Everything stopped. And from the stitched eyes of the face, a single black tear spilled down its cheek. I ran. I didn't look back. I climbed out of that tunnel and slammed the hatch shut so hard, I heard one of the floor joists crack. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, heard the whispers. The next day, I covered the hatch with concrete, told myself it was over, but it wasn't. Now, every night at exactly 3:14 a.m., the house wakes up. The floorboards thud. The walls whisper. And from beneath the living room, I hear something scratching, gently, persistently, like fingernails trying to claw their way back into the... Last night, I found a message etched into the hardwood floor. Letters carved with something sharp. Let me see again. I'm not alone here. I never was. And something under my house wants out. It's only a matter of time. There's something about winter that always made me feel safe, like the snow muffled the outside world just enough to give me peace. But that changed last year when I moved into the house at the edge of Whitestone Forest. It was cheap, too cheap, but I was desperate, fresh out of a breakup, tired of the city, and craving solitude. I didn't care that the place hadn't had tenants in almost 10 years. I told myself I liked the silence. I didn't know then what kind of silence it was. From the first day, it felt like something was watching me. I kept catching myself glancing at the windows, as if expecting to see a face peering in from the snow. The realtor had warned me the house was old and drafty, and I figured the strange creaks and groans were just the walls settling, the wind pressing through cracks in the beams. But it wasn't the wind that made me uneasy. It was the window. Every window in the house was different, slightly distorted, almost warped. They let in light in a way that made everything feel pale and sickly. On the second night, I noticed frost patterns forming on the inside of the not delicate snowflake designs. No. These were long, jagged streaks that curved like claw marks. And worse, some of them looked deliberate, like sketches, faces, eyes, watching. I scraped them off, thinking I was being paranoid. But the next morning, the marks returned. Different this. The eyes had moved. By the end of the week, I stopped going near the windows at night. I started keeping the curtains drawn, locking myself in the bedroom as if that would somehow stop the unease creeping into every part of the house. I tried to distract myself. Books, movies, music, but it didn't help. Because even with the curtains closed, I could feel them staring. One night, while brushing my teeth, I glanced at the bathroom mirror and froze. Behind me, just over my shoulder, was a reflection that didn't belong, an eye. Large, pale, wide open, pressed against the window behind me. But when I turned around, nothing was there, just snow falling outside. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow, small, bare, leading up to the house. They circled every window and stopped at the back door, but there were no prints leading away, and no one should have been out in that kind of cold without shoes, or skin for that matter. I called the sheriff, but he just shrugged it off. Told me animals sometimes leave weird tracks, especially when the snow drifts, but animals don't draw eyes on your windows. That evening, the power went out. I sat by the fireplace wrapped in every blanket I owned, trying to ignore the cold that crept into my bones, and then came the tapping, soft at first, barely noticeable, like the wind playing tricks, but it grew louder. Tap, 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 always 3 taps, a pause, then again. I stood slowly and moved toward the living room window, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The frost had returned, thicker this, covering the entire pane in those terrible drawings. Not just eyes now, faces, dozens of screaming, open mouthed, distorted like they'd been frozen mid-suffering. And in the center of the frost, written by a finger I couldn't see, were words. "You see us now." I staggered back, heart pounding. Something was wrong with it. It felt heavier, as if the house itself was breathing. I locked myself in the bedroom and didn't move until, when the light finally returned, I noticed something even more terrible. My reflection was in the hallway mirror. I didn't look quite like myself anymore. My eyes looked wider, glassier. My face seemed slightly warped, subtle enough that I almost doubted it. Almost. Then I saw it. The reflection behind me, a shadow, just a flicker, standing by the window, not in the room, just in the mirror, watching. That night, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. I rushed downstairs and found the living room window smashed. Cold air poured in like a flood, and on the snow-covered floor, I saw them. Bare footprints, wet and melting slowly into the wood. I followed them, even though every part of me screamed not to. They led to the basement door. I'd never opened it. Something about it made me uneasy from the start. It was sealed with thick nails, like someone had tried to keep it closed permanently. But now it was open, and from within I heard breathing. I stepped inside. The basement was pitch black. The only light came from the moonlit snow outside, filtering in through a narrow, broken window. That's when I saw eyes, hundreds of them, embedded in the walls, in the floor, in the ceiling. Frozen eyes like ice marbles, staring in every direction. Some were human, others weren't. And in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was something tall, thin, and wrong. It had no face, just a smooth layer of frost where features should be. But it had eyes, dozens of them, embedded across its chest and arms, all blinking in unison. I ran, I didn't stop. I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove through a snowstorm without a second thought. I never went back to that house, but the eyes did. They're with me now. The frost followed me to the apartment I moved into across town. The window started fogging again, and last week I saw a face in the glass of my bathroom mirror. Not mine. Its mouth was open, and it was whispering. I think they're still watching, and every time I pass a window, I feel them staring from behind the glass, waiting. The isolation didn't bother me at first. In fact, I welcomed it. After years of noise, people, and constant stress, the idea of spending winter in my late grandfather's cabin seemed like peace. The place was far from town, buried deep in the woods, no neighbors for miles, and reachable only by a long dirt path that twisted through skeletal trees like a forgotten scar. He'd left it to me in his will, and I never questioned why he insisted it stay in the family. Now I understand. Some places are not meant to be left alone. It was the third night when I noticed the door, not the front door, the one in the hallway near the kitchen. I had never seen it before. When I arrived, I remembered only two bedrooms, a pantry, and a basement hatch near the living room. But now somehow, there was a third door, completely ordinary at a glance. Faded wood, simple black knob, hinges rusted with age. But I didn't remember it being there. I tried opening it, locked. I searched for a key, even tore through old drawers and toolboxes my grandfather had left behind. Nothing. Eventually, I chalked it up to my own memory playing tricks on me. Maybe I hadn't noticed it. Maybe it had always been there, but it hadn't. I know it hadn't. The next morning, I found the door slightly open. I stood there for what felt like an hour, staring into the pitch black behind it. The air that seeped from inside wasn't cold. It was heavy, still. It had a kind of pressure to it, like standing in a room that had been sealed for decades. I didn't go in, just closed it, locked it again, and shoved a chair in front of it. But that night, I heard something knocking from the other side. 3 slow knocks, then silent. I lay awake, heart hammered, eyes fixed on the hallway, just waiting. Listen. The next day, I tried opening the door again. This time it swung open without resistance. There was no room behind it, just a staircase, narrow, steep, winding down in impossible darkness. I should have walked away. I should have sealed it shut, boarded it, burned it if I had to. But some horrible part of me needed to know where it led. I stepped down. The moment my foot hit the third step, I felt it, the cold. Not like winter cold. This was a deep, swallowing cold that came from inside things, not around them. The flashlight in my hand flickered, as if the air itself didn't want light. I continued anyway, counting each creaking step until I reached the bottom. A corridor stretched ahead, carved crudely into stone. The walls pulsed faintly, damp and breathing. At the far end, I saw movement, shadows, shifting impossible ways, like silhouettes trapped just beyond the reach of my light. I took another step forward, and that's when I saw them. Scratches on the stone walls. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Desperate claw marks, some etched with fingernails, others with bloodied bone, all leading in the same direction, away from. I should have turned back. But then I heard the voice. It was my grandfather's, whispering my name, software, gentle, like he used to when I was a child. I followed the sound, even though I knew it wasn't right. It led me into a narrow chamber filled with old furniture, tables, chairs, even a rusted crib, all half rotted and covered in strange symbols. In the center of the room sat a single rocking chair, moving slowly back and forth, empty. But there was something on the wall behind it, something carved deep into the stone. It was a face, not painted, not sculpted. It had grown from the flesh fused with rock, eyes sealed shut, mouth curled in a scream frozen mid-sound. Dozens of smaller faces surrounded it, as if absorbed into the surface. I turned and ran. As I climbed the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and wet, slapping the stone, getting closer with every second. I slammed the door shut, just as something pounded against it from the other side, hard, repeatedly. The entire frame shook, but the door held. I nailed it shut that night. Every bolt, every board, every piece of furniture I could find, piled in front of it like a barricade. But it wasn't enough, because now, every night, the knocking returns. Not just knocks, scratching, tapping, whispering, and it's getting stronger. Last night, I woke to find the boards splintering. The rocking chair, the one I saw downstairs, was in my living room, covered in dirt, still rocking. I don't know how much longer I can stay, but I can't leave either, because now there's a door in my bedroom. It wasn't there before, and it's open. I was never supposed to be there. It was my cousin's place, not mine. But he had to leave town unexpectedly, and he begged me to house sit for just 2 weeks. Keep the pipes from freezing, toss some food in the cat's bowl, and don't mind the wind. It gets loud at night, he said over the phone, just before his flight. I should have said no. I should have trusted that twist in my gut. But it was midwinter, I had nothing else going on, and the thought of being snowed in for a couple of weeks sounded almost peaceful. Besides, how bad could it really be? The house was quiet. Too quiet. It was one of those older homes on the edge of town, pushed up against a tree line that looked like it hadn't seen a chainsaw in decades. The kind of place that creaked for no reason and groaned like something old and tired lived in its walls. But it was clean, warm. The cat, a strange, silent tabby named Mallow, mostly stayed hidden under furniture. I figured we'd both ride out the snowstorm in our own corners. The first few nights passed without much trouble. The wind was loud, just like my cousin's. Sometimes it sounded like someone pacing outside. Other times it almost resembled voices, murmuring through the frozen air. I chalked it up to the trees bending in the wind and let it go, until the fourth night. That's when I found the footprints, fresh, wet prints in the hallway carpet. bare feet, human, small, almost child-sized. They led from the front door all the way to the basement door, one after the other, perfectly spaced, soaked into the carpet fibers. But the front door was still locked. No broken windows, no forced entry, just wet footprints leading down. I checked the basement, but there was nothing, just old boxes, rusted tools, and the smell of damp wood. I stood there with a flashlight, trying not to feel like I was being watched from the corners. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about those prints, how the toes were slightly off kilter, like whoever made them had broken bones or worse, like they weren't quite human at all. The next morning, there were more of them, leading from the basement into the kitchen. That's when the house stopped feeling empty. I started hearing things, faint knocking on the walls, scratching from inside the floorboards, whispering, just under the edge of hearing, like someone talking through a wall of ice. Sometimes I'd find things moved, chairs slightly turned, cabinet doors open, spoons left on the floor. I told myself it was the cat, but Mallow wouldn't even enter those rooms. He stayed glued under the couch, eyes wide, trembling, and then I started seeing her. Just flashes at first, reflections in windows, a pale face behind me in mirrors, long, wet hair clinging to her face, mouth hanging slightly open, eyes too wide, too cold. She was always standing still, never moving, never blinking, just watching. One night, I woke up gasping, breath fogging the air. The temperature had dropped, and my blanket had been pulled off. In the doorway, silhouetted by the hallway light, was a shape, thin, drenched, bare feet pressed into the carpet, leaving fresh prints. She didn't move. I shut my eyes. When I opened them again, she was gone, but the footprints stayed. The next morning, I tried calling my cousin. No answer. I packed a bag, ready to leave early, and just forget the whole thing. But when I tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. The knob turned, but the door felt sealed shut, as if something was pushing back from the other side. I tried the windows, frozen solid. No matter how hard I pulled or slammed, they wouldn't break. I was trapped. That night, the knocking started again. But it wasn't on the walls this time. It was inside the bedroom. I woke up to 3 slow knocks right behind me. I turned over and saw nothing. But the blanket was soaked, the floor cold, and in the fogged-up window above my bed, a message had been drawn by a finger. You shouldn't be here. I barely made it through the night. The next morning, I noticed something else. My reflection wasn't moving correctly. I'd turn my head and the reflection would lag behind. Its mouth would twitch slightly, its eyes would narrow when mine didn't. I smashed the mirror, but that night I saw her again. This time, she was inside the room, standing in the corner, bare feet dripping onto the hardwood. Her skin was pale, cracked, and her jaw hung loose as if unhinged. Her eyes rolled in different directions, unfocused and dead. And in her hands, God, in her hand, was a long, splintered mirror shard. She raised it slowly, pointing at me, and then she started walking forward. I don't remember much after that, must have blacked out. When I woke, it was morning. The door was open, the snow had stopped, and Mallow was gone. I ran. I didn't even grab my things. I just left, got in the car, and drove until I couldn't see the woods anymore. But I haven't really left her behind. Because sometimes I still see wet footprints in my apartment hallway. Sometimes the mirrors twitch, and at night, when the wind howls through the cracks in my window, I hear her voice, whispering the same words again and again. You shouldn't be here. But it's too late now. She's already inside. I was never scared of being alone. Not until that winter. After my breakup, I needed space. I wanted silence, distance, something to wash the noise out of my head. My friend Lisa offered me her parents' old cottage while they were overseas. It's peaceful out there. No one for miles. You'll be able to breathe again. She wasn't wrong. The place sat on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by nothing but pine trees and a narrow trail that vanished under layers of snow. The cottage had a rustic charm. Creaky floors, wood-burning stove, heavy curtains, but I liked it. It felt untouched by the world. The first week was calm. I read books by the fire, watched snow pile up outside the windows, and let the silence settle over me like a blanket. It was comforting at first, like the house was hibernating with me. But it didn't stay comforting for long. It started with the doorbell. I didn't even know the cottage had a doorbell. But late one night, around 2:13 a.m., I heard it. One sharp, clear ring. I froze. No one was supposed to be out here. I hadn't seen another person in a week. I peeked out the front window, heart racing. Nothing. Just the porch, covered in fresh snow, completely untouched. No footprints, no tracks, just the silent white stretching out into the trees. I stood there for a while, confused, unnerved. Maybe it was a malfunction. Maybe cold messed with the wiring. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The next night, it rang again, same time, 2:13 a.m. This time I checked the porch immediately. Still nothing, but when I looked down, I noticed something strange. The doormat was soaked, completely drenched, as if someone had been standing there dripping wet. But the snow around it was still undisturbed. No prints, no melting, just the wet mat, as if the house itself had started to sweat. I tried not to panic, told myself I was imagining things. That isolation was getting to me. I went for long hikes during the day to clear my head, but I always came back with that lingering unease, that feeling you get when you know you're being watched but you can't prove it. Then came the tapping. Not on the doors, on the windows, soft, rhythmic tapping, like long fingernails brushing against the glass. Always at night, always on a different window, kitchen, then living room, then bedroom. I would rush to check every time, and there would never be any. But one night I stayed still. I didn't move. I didn't open the curtains. I just listened, and I realized the tapping wasn't random. It was a pattern, a rhythm, almost like it was spelling something out. I started counting. 3 taps, 2, 1, 4, 3, 1, 1, over and over. It didn't make sense until I saw it written on the bathroom mirror the next morning. A message in fog, even though the mirror hadn't steamed up. 3142311. A phone number, maybe, or a code. I tried calling it from my cell, but there was only static. No ringing, no voice, just a faint, almost breath-like hiss. Then, a whisper, a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. Let me in. I dropped the phone. That night, I barricaded the doors, covered the windows, left every light on. But at exactly 2:13 a.m., the power went out. Everything was swallowed in darkness, and then I heard the footsteps, slow, heavy, crunching in the snow outside. This time, there were multiple sets, not just one. I crept to the window, peeled the curtain back just an inch, and I saw them, figures, dozens of them, standing still in the snow, surrounding the house, barefoot, soaking wet, some tall, some twisted, all facing the house. Their heads twitched slightly, like they were listening for. And then one of them raised a hand and pointed directly at me. The others followed, every arm snapping up in unison. Then the tapping began again, all around me, every window, every wall, the same rhythm. I screamed. I don't even remember how long I sat in the corner of that room, hands over my ears, shaking. But eventually the tapping stopped. When the sun came up, they were gone. But the snow outside was littered with wet footprints, circling the house over and over again. I packed my things and left that morning. Didn't even lock the door behind me. I didn't care. But it followed me. Even now, back in my apartment, I still wake at 2:13 a.m., still hear the soft tap, tap, tap on the glass. Sometimes it's on the balcony. Sometimes my bathroom mirror is fogged when I haven't showered. And once, just once, I found a soaked doormat at my front door. I threw it away, but the floor still feels wet beneath it. And I swear, sometimes, in the dark reflection of the TV screen, I see them, all of them, still standing there, still waiting for me to let them in. I don't talk about that winter much, not because I've forgotten, but because I remember everything too clearly. I was between jobs and desperately needed a break from the city. My aunt offered me her cabin up north, a secluded little place tucked deep in a snow-covered valley, away from roads, away from people, away from everything. It was meant to be a chance to disconnect, recharge, and find peace. It was anything but peaceful. The first night was quiet, just snow falling endlessly outside and the steady crackle of firewood in the stove. The silence was thick but not oppressive, at least not yet. The second night, I noticed something strange. There were footprints on the back porch, bare feet, pressed deep into the snow, leading from the tree line to the door. I stood there, staring through the frosted glass, trying to make sense of it. There were no prints leading away, just to the door, then nothing. I opened it slowly and looked around. The wind had already begun to cover them, but I saw what I saw. The tracks were fresh, and they stopped right at the threshold. But no knock, no sound, just cold silence. I should have left them. That night I locked every door, every window, but I couldn't stop the feeling that something was watching me from outside. I tried to sleep, but the walls creaked too much. I kept waking to distant thumps, like something shifting around inside the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. Then came the dreams. Every night I'd see the same thing, a figure standing in the snow just beyond the tree line, still, silent, always watching. I could never see a face, only a vague outline, but it was tall, impossibly thin and wrong somehow. It looked like a person who had forgotten how to be human. And in the dream, I always heard the same sound, soft whispering behind me, like breath against my neck. No words, just sound, cold and damp and hungry. I started waking up to strange things. One morning, I found my boots outside, sitting neatly on the porch steps, covered in frost. I hadn't worn them in days. Another morning, the firewood was rearranged, stacked into a strange shape, a spiral pointing toward the door. I stared at it for a long time, feeling like something was trying to speak a language I didn't know. But what broke me was the cellar. I didn't even know the cabin had one, but I found it by accident under a warped rug in the kitchen, a trapdoor with a rusted ring handle. The wood was old and splintered, and when I lifted it, I swear I felt a rush of cold air that didn't belong. I shouldn't have gone down there, but I did. The cellar was cramped, the walls lined with old shelves and dust-caked jars. Nothing unusual until I saw the marks. Dozens of long, deep claw marks across the wooden beams. Not scratches, not animal damage. Scratches made by fingers, human fingers. The wood was torn in places, grooves dug deep like someone had tried to climb out or tried to claw something. And in the far corner was a shape, a bundled tarp. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But I pulled it back. Underneath was a face, a photograph aged and brittle, nailed to the floor. The image was of a man, tall, gaunt, eyes sunken and blackened like bruises. Behind him stood the cabin, unchanged, and written in shaky ink across the bottom was one line: he never left. I left the cellar and sealed the door behind me, but it didn't matter, because that night I heard footsteps in the kitchen. I froze in bed, breath caught in my throat. The sound was heavy, deliberate, slow. I could hear it walking in circles, around the table, toward the firewood stack, over to the trapdoor. Then silence. I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on until sunrise. And when I finally stepped out of my room, I saw it. The cellar door was open, wide open. The spiral of firewood was gone, replaced by something else. Twigs arranged into a crude figure, arms, legs, a head, like a warning or a message. I left that morning. I didn't pack. I didn't even grab my phone. I just drove until I couldn't see snow anymore. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was tired, alone, overwhelmed. But then a week later, Lisa called me. Her voice was shaking. "You said the cabin was locked up when you left, right?" "Yes," I said slowly. "Why?" "Because the caretaker went to check it yesterday. The trapdoor was open and there were footprints in the kitchen." I didn't respond. "Bare footprints," she whispered. "But the thing is, the snow inside wasn't fresh. It looked like it had been walked in every night since you left." And then she asked the question I didn't want to hear. "Are you sure you're alone right now? Because sometimes when I'm home, safe, warm, I still hear footsteps in my hallway. And every now and then, I find my boots outside again, covered in frost." I don't really tell people about what happened that winter, not because I'm afraid they won't believe me, but because I'm afraid they will. I was house sitting for my brother while he and his wife took a trip to Iceland. Their house was newer, modern, kind of minimalist in design, all glass and sharp corners, tucked in a quiet neighborhood that was unusually empty during the holidays. Most of the neighbors had traveled out of town, and the entire street felt like it had been swallowed by snow and silence. It was supposed to be simple: water the plants, feed the cat, shovel the driveway. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time reading, watching TV, and letting their black cat Knox curl up beside me in the evening. But by the fourth night, Knox started acting strange. She'd sit in the hallway, just outside the guest room where I slept, and stare at the front door. Not move, not blink, just stare. Her ears would twitch like she was hearing something I couldn't, and she'd hiss at absolutely nothing. I figured it was just a cat thing. Maybe she was bored. Maybe she missed my brother. But then I heard it. It was around 3 a.m. I'd just gotten up to use the bathroom when I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, measured. Someone walking across the hallway above me. Except no one was supposed to be there. I was alone. The second floor was completely empty. I held my breath and listened. Step, step, pause. The sound stopped right above me, directly above the guest room. I stared at the ceiling, heart hammering. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I imagined it, I heard something worse. A door creaked open upstairs. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy book from the coffee table, and slowly made my way up the stairs. Every step felt heavier than the last, but when I reached the hallway, every door was shut. The lights were off. Everything looked undisturbed, except for the air. It felt colder, thicker, like the house was breathing. I checked every room. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Just silent. I went back downstairs and tried to sleep, but the moment I turned off the light, I heard it again, whispering. Not loud, not even coherent, just a constant low murmur coming from the vents, like someone was speaking softly through the walls. That's when I started dreaming. Every night, the same nightmare. I'm standing at the top of the stairs, looking down into the living room. Everything is dark, except for one small, flickering light near the fireplace. And standing in that light is a man. He's tall, with elongated arms, a crooked head tilted at an unnatural angle. His skin is grayish, and his eyes are glassy, not blinking, not moving, just fixed on me. I always wake up right before he takes a step toward the stairs. After a few days, things escalated. The lights would flicker randomly. I'd hear knocking on the walls, on the windows, on the doors, but always in a pattern. 3 knocks, 2 seconds, 3 more, over and over. One night, I decided to record it. I set up my phone on the kitchen counter and let it run while I slept. The next morning, I watched the footage. Around 3:11 a.m., the camera picked up movement, not a person, but a shadow, shifting across the far wall. It didn't belong to anything in the room. It slithered across the counter and disappeared through the hallway toward the stairs. And then something even worse happened. The video cut out for exactly 43 seconds. When it resumed, the camera was tilted, as if someone had picked it up and set it back down. And the last few frames showed something blurry moving past the lens, something gray, pale, and thin. That day, I called my brother. I told him I wasn't comfortable staying there anymore. He sounded concerned, but not surprised. "Listen," he said, hesitating. "Did you ever go into the basement?" "No," I said. Why?" He was quiet for a moment, too long. "There's something down there. We've both seen it, but it never did anything before." I didn't respond. I didn't want to know more. But later that night, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the basement door. The air hit me like a wall, damp, icy, and suffocating. I stood at the top of the stairs, unsure why I was even doing this. Then I heard it again, whispering, clearer now, like voices arguing in a language I didn't understand. I took one step down, and the whispering stopped, followed by breathing, not mine. Something was breathing in the dark at the bottom of the stairs. I didn't go any further. I closed the door and shoved a chair under the knob. I didn't sleep that night, and when I woke in the morning, the basement door was open. The chair had been knocked aside, and the hinges on the door were bent outward, like something had forced its way up from beneath. I left the house that day and stayed in a hotel until my brother returned. I never told him everything, just that I felt sick, needed to leave. But last week he called me again. His voice was low, distant, like he was scared to say what he really wanted to say. "You remember the thing in the basement?" he asked. "Yes, it's not down there anymore." Then he hung up. And now, at night, I've started hearing whispering through my vents again. Only this time, I don't live in that house, and I don't have a basement, but something keeps knocking at my walls anyway. 3 knocks, pause. 3 knocks again. I remember the exact moment the winter stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling like a cage. I had just moved into a small rental cottage out by the woods. It was supposed to be a quiet place where I could work on my writing and clear my head after a messy breakup. The cabin was rustic, creaky floors, a drafty roof, a fireplace that smoked more than it warmed, but it had charm, or so I thought at first. The landlord was an older man who didn't talk much, just handed me the keys, muttered something about keeping the place quiet, and left without making eye contact. I didn't think much of it then. The first week was uneventful, almost peaceful. Snow fell in a constant hush outside the windows, blanketing everything in white silence. I barely left the cabin. I read, I wrote, I made soup. I watched the snow pile higher. But on the 8th night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking around the outside of the cabin. Slow steps, crunching snow, circling the house. I lay there frozen in my bed, listening. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They walked a full loop around the house. Then, silence. I waited until morning before going outside. There were no footprints. I told myself it was a deer, maybe wind shifting the old boards. But part of me already knew it wasn't that simple, because that night, it happened again and again. Every night after that, the steps returned, always circling, always at the same slow pace. Then, on the 11th night, I woke to something different. The steps stopped, right outside my bedroom window. I stared at the curtain, heart pounding, not daring to move. There was no knock, no noise, but I felt it. Someone was standing there, just watching. Eventually, I drifted back into a restless sleep. But when I woke the next morning, the window was open, just a crack, just enough to let in the cold. I was certain I had closed it. That day, I walked into the nearby town, asked the local clerk about the area. When I mentioned the cabin, he gave me a strange look. "You're up in Bishop's Hollow, right?" "Yeah." He hesitated, then said, "People don't usually stay there in the winter. Why not?" "Cabin's old. Strange stories. No one's sure what's true anymore." I asked what he meant, but he just shrugged. "Keep your doors locked," he said. That night, I barricaded every door and window. I even nailed shut the one that had been opened, but something still felt wrong. Around midnight, I was reading on the couch when I heard a sound from the kitchen, the soft clink of silverware, like someone gently lifting a spoon from the drawer. I stood and walked toward the sink. There was no one there, but a single spoon sat on the counter. It was ice cold to the touch. I didn't sleep. Then things escalated. The next day, I found handprints on the inside of the bathroom mirror, as if someone had pressed their fingers against it from behind. Smeared, pale, almost childlike prints. Another night, I found muddy footprints in the hallway, bare feet again. The prints led from the front door to the closet, but the door had never opened. When I yanked it open, nothing, until I checked the wall. Scratched into the wood were words, dozens of them. overlapping in a frantic scrawl. I'm not alone. I'm not alone. I'm not alone. I scrubbed them off, but the next morning they were back, deeper, sharper, like they'd been carved with nails. I called the landlord, told him something was wrong. His response chilled me. It's best not to notice it too much, he said. It gets stronger when you notice. What the hell does that mean? But he just hung up. That night, I heard it inside the house. The footsteps, no longer outside, no longer distant. They were in the hallway now, and this time, they stopped right outside my bedroom door. Then, the knob turned, just slightly, just a twitch, and then came the whisper, so soft, I barely heard it over the blood rushing in my ears. Let me in. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. When the sun rose, I found the doorknob scratched, as if a dozen fingers had been twisting and clawing at it all night. I decided to leave, packed what I could, and rushed into town to find the landlord again. But he was gone. No one had seen him in weeks. The number he gave me didn't even exist. I went back to the cabin one last time to grab my things, but when I stepped inside, it felt different, colder, heavier. There were muddy prints all over the floor, symbols drawn in ash on the walls, and on the mirror in the hallway, a message written in fogged breath. You noticed me. I left everything behind. I moved far away, never told anyone the full story, but sometimes, in the dead of winter, when snow begins to fall and silence creeps in, I swear I still hear those footsteps, circling my house, always slower now, always closer. It started with a power outage. I was alone in my parents' old winter cottage, a remote place deep in the forest where the snow piled high and no cell signal ever reached. They hadn't been up there in years, but I decided to stay for a week after my university break, just to escape the noise, clear my head, and breathe in some quiet. The cottage was dusty but intact. The fireplace still worked, the pantry still had canned goods, and I brought books and a solar-powered radio to keep myself entertained. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but on the third night, a storm rolled. Heavy wind, ice pelting the roof, and then darkness. The lights went out and no warning, just silence and black. I lit a few candles and bundled up by the fireplace. It was manageable until I heard what I thought was a knock on the back door. I froze. It was soft. Tap, tap, tap. Almost polite, but somehow that made it worse. Who would knock during a snowstorm this far out in the woods? I told myself it was a tree branch, maybe ice shifting, but I didn't move toward the door. I waited until it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Same rhythm, same patience. I approached the door slowly. Every instinct told me not to open it, but I had to know. When I peeked out through the curtain, there was nothing there, just snow. But when I turned back to the living room, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A damp boot print on the wooden floor. Just one. It was near the window. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching shadows twitch in the candlelight, heart racing with every creak in the old floorboard. But nothing else happened. Until the next morning. When I stepped outside to check for tracks, I found none. Not one. The snow around the house was pristine, untouched, but that didn't make sense. Where had the boot print come from? Later, I noticed things were moved. The spoon I left on the counter was in the sink. My notebook had a torn corner I didn't remember. My toothbrush was damp. Even though I hadn't used it yet, I began to wonder if I was slipping. Isolation playing tricks on my mind. But that night, it escalated. The knocking returned. Not just at the back door this time, but at every window. Soft, deliberate. One knock after the next, moving from one window to the next like someone pacing in circles around the cottage. I sat in the middle of the living room, hugging a fire poker, candles flickering wildly, trying to listen to the pattern. It never changed. Always the same 3 knocks, followed by silence, and then the next window. I thought about running into the woods, but I'd freeze. I thought about hiding, but the cottage was too small. I felt trapped. And then the whispering started. Low, hushed, almost like it came from beneath the floorboards. I pressed my ear to the ground, terrified of what I might hear, and I did hear something. Breathing, shallow, slow, but unmistakably human. That night, I blocked every door and window with furniture. I didn't sleep, I just watched. Around 3 a.m., I noticed a flicker in the corner of the room. Not from the candlelight, but from a shadow. It didn't move like a flicker. It moved like it stepped forward. I stared, eyes burning, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadow seemed to ripple on the wall. Humanoid, but wrong. Its arms too long, its head lolling sideways like it didn't have a neck. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The next morning, I found a new message written on the window glass, fogged from the inside. Let me in. You saw me. I packed to leave. I didn't care about this. I was ready to run through the woods barefoot. But when I opened the front door, I saw something that froze me. There were 2 sets of boot prints, not leading to the door, but leading from it inside. That night, I tried to burn the place down. I poured lighter fluid from the emergency kit, lit a match, and tossed it on the floor. Nothing caught. The flame fizzled instantly like the house rejected fire itself. I don't know how to explain it. The place just wouldn't burn, like it wanted to keep me inside. Keep something inside. I screamed, I cried. I begged the silence for it to stop, but the whispering only got louder. Now I don't know how many days it's been. The snow never stops falling. The road out doesn't seem to exist anymore. I've walked in one direction for hours, only to find myself back at the cottage, over and over. Time feels warped. Hours stretch into days. Candles burn too fast. My watch stopped working. I tried breaking a window, but the shards just turned to frost in my hands. And now, when I look into the mirror, I don't see myself any. I see a face that looks like mine, but smiles when I'm not smiling. Sometimes when I sleep, or think I sleep, I dream that I'm still in the cottage, but I'm not alone. There's something breathing right beside me. I can feel its mouth near my ear, whispering things in a voice that sounds almost like my own. I don't know if I'm still in the cabin. I don't know if I ever really left. But every winter, when the snow begins to fall again, I swear I hear knocking at my door. 3 knocks, and I never know if it's real or if it's just me, still trying to get back in. It began with the silence, not just the absence of noise. I'm talking about a kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, like pressure underwater. A silence that's so thick and unnatural it feels like the world itself is holding its breath. That was the first thing I noticed when I arrived at my uncle's winter lodge. He'd passed away just a month prior, a heart attack, and I was asked to go stay there temporarily to keep the pipes from freezing and check in on things. He'd lived alone, deep in the forest, and I hadn't seen him since I was a teenager. I remembered the place being cozy when I was young, but when I returned as an adult, it felt different, cold in a way no fire could fix. The walls seemed darker, the windows taller, the corners too quiet. The house was exactly the same, yet something in me recoiled the moment I stepped inside, like I'd walked into a space that had grown used to being alone and didn't like being disturbed. The first night was uneventful, if unsettling. I lit a fire, made some food, and read until I fell asleep. But when I woke the next morning, I found something strange on the living room floor, a trail of small pine needles leading from the back door to the fireplace. It wasn't snow. It wasn't mud, just a precise, deliberate trail. I thought I might have tracked them in myself, until I realized the back door had been bolted shut from the inside all night. That was the first detail I brushed off. The second was the ticking sound that started around midnight every night. I couldn't find the source. It wasn't a clock. I checked every room. It didn't echo like a pipe or a heater. It sounded like something ticking directly against the wallboards, almost inside them, sometimes just behind my bed. Steady, hollow, tick, tick, tick. It stopped at exactly 3:03 a.m. every time. After 3 nights, I was losing sleep and getting paranoid. I even started recording the sound on my phone. But when I played it back in the morning, there was nothing, not a single tick, just static. I began checking the house obsessively, looking in closets, under floorboards, inside the chimney, nothing until the 5th. That's when I found the door, a small wooden hatch behind a bookshelf in the basement. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended perfectly into the wall. No handle, just a tiny iron latch. I pried it open. Inside was a narrow crawl space, the kind that looked like it had been carved out by hand, rather than designed to be there. The air inside was colder than anywhere else in the house, and it stank of dirt and damp rot. At the very end of that space, I saw something carved into the wall, a circle, and beneath it, a symbol I didn't recognize, a crude stick figure, with its arms pointing downward, head surrounded by vertical lines like sun rays. I took a photo of it and went back upstairs, feeling uneasy. That night, the ticking sound didn't come from the walls. It came from the crawl space door. Tick, 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 louder than ever. Almost like knocking now. Not with knuckles, with nails. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, fireplace roaring, a knife in hand. The noise continued until 3:03 a.m. exactly. Then, silence. But when I checked the crawl space in the morning, the symbol had changed. The figure's arms were now raised, like it was reaching for. That's when I started seeing it. Not clearly, not at first. Just a shape in the reflection of the window. A shadow standing behind me when I washed my face. A tall, thin outline just outside, the glow of the firelight. Always in the background. Always still. On the 7th night, I tried to leave. Packed everything and ran out into the snow. But no matter which path I took, I kept ending up back at the lodge. The forest looped on its. I left markings on trees, took photos, used the compass on my phone. It didn't matter. After hours of walking in a straight line, I ended up right where I started. I felt like the forest had curled itself around the house, like a cage made of bark and ice. That night, the ticking became a pounding. Bang, bang, bang. From the walls, the ceiling, the crawl space. And then voices, low whispers, in a language I didn't understand, rhythmic like a chant. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside my head, vibrating in my skull like my thoughts were no longer mine. When I checked the crawl space one last time, the symbol had changed again. Now there were two figures beside the circle. One was still reaching upward. The other was kneeling, carved violently, deeply into the wood. Above it, scratched in desperate, shaky handwriting, were the words, "The offering is made. It comes at 3:03. I stayed awake until then. At 3:03, everything in the house went silent. Even the wind outside stopped. And then the door opened. Not the crawlspace door, the front door. It creaked open on it slowly, like something was finally stepping in after a long wait. I didn't see it clearly, but I felt it. Something tall, something ancient, something made of wood and bone and silence. It stepped inside, unseen but undeniable, and stood over me. And I heard one final whisper, close to my ear. "You stayed too long." The next morning I woke on the living room floor. Everything seemed normal. The house was quiet again. No ticking, no voices. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize my reflection. The eyes were mine, but everything else wasn't. And now, every night at 3:03, I feel something watching me. No matter where I go, even back home. Because I think I didn't leave the lodge. Not all of me. Something stayed behind. And something else came back in my place. I didn't even want the house. It was left to me in a will. A distant great aunt I barely remembered. My parents told me she was eccentric, a recluse who spoke to mirrors and believed crows brought messages from the dead. I thought it was just old folklore. But when the house became mine, I figured a quiet winter retreat in the woods wouldn't be the worst thing. I wish I had never stepped inside. The house sat on a frost-bitten hill, surrounded by brittle pines and tangled brush. Snow blanketed everything, thick, untouched, perfect, too perfect. Like the forest had gone still for something it didn't want to disturb. Inside, the house was old, but clean. Dusty floral wallpaper, faded portraits, creaking floorboard. The furniture looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. It smelled faintly of lavender and something else I couldn't place at first. Something sour and sweet, like rotting fruit. I settled in, brought a few groceries, started the fireplace, and tried to convince myself this was a peaceful getaway. I even joked to friends that it would be good for my mental health. Isolation, nature, fresh air. But that first night, I woke to footsteps upstairs, slow, heavy, unmistakable. I froze in bed listening, half convinced it was a dream. But then the footsteps paused, and I heard a door creak open. One of the old upstairs bedrooms. I grabbed a flashlight and walked up, every step on the stairs making my skin crawl. Nothing was there. But one door, the farthest room at the end of the hall, was cracked open. I hadn't touched it before. When I stepped inside, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, like walking into a freezer. The room was empty except for a mirror, tall, full length, standing in the corner. It looked out of place, untouched by dust, perfectly clean, and there were fingerprints on the glass. I didn't see them until I got close. Long, thin smudges, trailing down the mirror's surface from the top, as if someone had pressed their hands to it from the other side and slowly dragged them downward. That night, I moved the mirror into the hallway. I didn't want it in that room. But when I woke the next morning, it was back, right where it had been. I thought maybe I'd forgotten, or maybe I'd been half asleep and dreamed moving it. But it happened again the next night. I moved it downstairs and woke to find it not just back in the room, but closer to the bed. I started locking the door, but the handle would rattle violently around 3 a.m. every night. Eventually, I smashed the mirror, shattered it with a fireplace poker. Glass everywhere. I wrapped it all in towels and tossed it outside into the snow. That was the night the whispering started. Faint at first, barely audible, but it was always coming from the upstairs hallway like someone pacing just beyond view, mumbling softly under their breath. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, urgent, hungry. And then the dreams began. I'd find myself back in that bedroom, staring into the mirror. Only now the reflection wasn't mine. It was watching me, a figure with my shape, my eyes, but nothing else was. Its face was slightly wrong. Its mouth moved on its own. It would raise its hand in the mirror, but mine wouldn't move. It wasn't copying me. It was studying me. Sometimes it would smile. Sometimes it would tap on the glass. When I woke from one of those dreams, I found a single shard of mirror on it. I hadn't touched the trash out. I had no idea how it got there. Then came the final, undeniable moment. I was in the bathroom brushing my... I leaned toward the mirror over the sink. Nothing unusual until I saw it. My reflection didn't blink when I did. It just stared, expressionless. Then slowly, It began to open its mouth wider and wider, far beyond what should be possible, as if the jaw was unhinging. I dropped the toothbrush, backed away in panic. When I looked again, everything was normal. But from that night on, I avoided mirrors completely. It didn't help. I began catching glimpses of myself in windows, in the glass of picture frame, in the black screen of my phone when it was off. And every time, it looked slightly different. The reflection didn't just stare anymore. It mimicked what I hadn't done yet. It moved before me, as if it wasn't reflecting, but anticipating. One night, during a power outage, I lit candles and sat in the living room. Snow fell hard outside. I tried to ignore the tapping on the upstairs door, the scratching behind the walls, the voice that now spoke in a hoarse whisper that sounded just like mine, asking from behind the closed bedroom door, "Can I come in now?" I left the next day. Didn't pack, didn't look back. But even now, weeks later, I keep catching glimpses of something in store windows, in car mirrors, in the glass of my apartment oven door. And last night, I woke to see myself standing in the hallway, watching me sleep. Not reflected, not imagined, just standing there, smiling, waiting. I was never afraid of being alone. In fact, I preferred it. Solitude was comforting, a break from the noise, the expectations, the endless distractions of people. That's why I agreed to house sit for a friend who was traveling abroad. Their cabin was deep in the mountains, far from anything, a perfect winter escape. Just me, the snow, and silence. But it wasn't silence that greeted me when I arrived. It was humming, faint and low, like an old lullaby coming through the walls. I dismissed it at first. Maybe a pipe or an old heater rumbling somewhere under the floorboards. The place was nearly 50 years old, after all. My friend had warned me it made noises, but nothing to worry about. But the humming wasn't mechanical. It was melodic, almost human. The first few days were quiet otherwise. I settled in, stocked up firewood, kept the fireplace burning, and spent evenings reading by the dim glow of lanterns. I slept well, until one night I woke up around 2 a.m. with an overwhelming sense of pressure in my ears, like being deep underwater. The humming had returned, louder now, and it vibrated through the walls, low and steady. But this time, there was something new, a creaking sound above me, footsteps in the attic. I froze, heart pounding. I hadn't even checked the attic yet. The entrance was a small pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. I stared at it in the darkness, waiting for the sound again. Nothing, just silence. I tried to convince myself it was wood settling from the cold, but I didn't sleep the rest of the next morning. I pulled down the ladder and climbed up. The attic was empty, dust covering everything, except one patch near the window. There, I saw faint shoe prints, barely visible, as if someone had been standing there, watching the woods, watching me arrive. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe they were old prints. Maybe my friend had forgotten to clean something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I had a growing feeling I was being observed, not from outside the house, but from within it. By the fifth night, things began to twist. Time became unreliable. I'd check the clock only to find hours had passed in minutes, or minutes felt like hours. Sometimes I'd find the fireplace burned out, even though I just lit it. Once I made tea and walked into the living room. When I returned to the kitchen, the kettle was cold, bone dry, like it hadn't been used in days. And then, the mirror. There was only one in the entire house, a small circular one in the bathroom. One evening, while brushing my teeth, I noticed something wrong. My reflection's mouth wasn't moving in sync with mine. I stopped brushing. My reflection didn't. It just stared, then slowly smiled and whispered something I couldn't hear. The next morning, I smashed the mirror. I couldn't look at it anymore. But that night, the humming returned, this time joined by whispers beneath it. Dozens of voices layered over each other, like an invisible choir, echoing through the walls. I couldn't make out words, but the intent was clear. They weren't humming to calm me. They were trying to lull me into something. I began hearing things outside, too. Soft knocking on the windows, footsteps in the snow, even though the paths were always untouched by morning. One night, I saw myself standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. Who would believe me? Even I didn't fully believe it until I found the journal. It was tucked behind a loose panel in the living room wall. Old, brittle pages written in trembling handwriting. "The house changes you," one entry read. "You forget who you are. You forget what's real. Sometimes it lets you leave, but not all of you goes. Part of you stays. Part of you watches." Another page had only one sentence, scribbled over and over. "Don't look in the mirror." But the mirror was already gone, or so I thought. On my last night there, I woke up to find a mirror in a large, full-length one standing in the corner, one I had never seen before. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at it, too afraid to move, and my reflection moved first. It walked toward me, smiling. I blacked out before I could scream. When I came to, it was morning. No mirror, no footprints, no sign of anything. But I left that day. I didn't wait for my friend to return. I couldn't. The house felt alive, like it knew I was trying to leave. And when I got home, I noticed something strange. Every mirror in my apartment, the bathroom, the hallway, even the screen of my phone when it went dark, showed something different, something off. My reflection is no longer my own. It smiles when I don't, blinks out of sync. Sometimes it lingers a second longer than it should, and every so often, I hear a soft humming through the walls, as if a piece of that house followed me home. Or maybe I never really left it at all. I moved into the cabin for clarity, not comfort. After a terrible breakup and the slow collapse of my career, I needed to disappear for a while. My therapist suggested solitude, and I thought, why not? A remote winter cabin sounded like the perfect place to reset everything. I rented it online, a simple wooden home in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, untouched snow, and a frozen lake. The pictures showed a rustic charm, quiet beauty, and just enough modern amenities to make it livable. The listing even bragged about the total absence of neighbors. At first, that sounded like a blessing. Now I understand it was a warning. The first few nights were peaceful. The wind howled through the trees. The fire crackled softly, and I felt myself beginning to breathe again. I journaled, cooked, read books, tried to find pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. But by the fourth night, things shifted. It started with the walls. They creaked, not from the cold, but in rhythm, like slow breathing. Inhale, exhale. At first, I laughed it off. Just an old house settling, right? But then came the smell. It was faint, like wet soil and copper. Not strong enough to alarm me, just enough to be noticed. It came and went. I searched for mold, old food, even dead animals under the floorboards. Nothing. Then, the house began closing in on me, literally. I didn't notice it at first. But one morning, I went to the kitchen and hit my head on the doorframe. Strange, since I'd passed through it 100 times without trouble. I measured it later that day. It was an inch shorter than before. I thought I was imagining things. Cabin fever, right? But it kept happening. The hallway seemed narrower, the bathroom ceiling lower. A few days later, I couldn't open a window that had opened just fine the day before. The frame had somehow shifted. The cabin was shrinking. I tried to leave. I packed my bags, loaded the car, and drove down the snowy trail leading back to the highway. But after an hour, I passed the cabin again. I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, so I tried again. GPS didn't work, no signal out here. But I retraced the path manually, using the landmarks I remembered from the way in. The same sharp bend, the same crooked pine tree, the same frozen stream. But every time I drove away, I ended up back at the cabin. It didn't make sense. It wasn't a circle. I wasn't looping. The compass on my dashboard even confirmed it. I was driving south, then west, then north. Yet I always returned to the same gravel driveway and the same damn cabin door. That's when I realized the forest wasn't real anymore. Or at least, not mine anymore. I stayed another night. What choice did I have? I told myself I'd try again in the morning with more light. But that night, I heard voices, not from outside, in the walls. They weren't speaking clear, just low murmurs, fragments of sentences, echoing through the wooden boards like water through pipes. Sometimes it sounded like my own voice. Other times, it mimicked people I knew. My ex, my mother, even my childhood friend who'd passed away years ago. I heard them laughing, whispering my name. I punched a hole in the wall in a fit of desperation. There was nothing behind it. No insulation, no wiring, just darkness. A black empty void where solid wood should have been. I screamed into it, hoping to hear an echo. I didn't. The next day, the front door was gone, just a wall where I searched the whole house. No doors, no windows, nothing but four wooden walls pressing in closer, day by day. The fireplace had extinguished on its own and refused to relight. The lights flickered constantly and failed entirely. I was in absolute darkness by nightfall. And that copper soil smell? It got stronger, thick, suffocating. It came from the floor. I tore up a board with a crowbar, desperate to find anything, an exit, a basement, something. There was no foundation, just flesh, a slick, pulsating membrane stretched beneath the house, rippling every time I moved. It quivered when I touched it. I swear I heard it sigh. The house wasn't just alive, it was feeding off me. Every thought, every fear, every moment of silence, it devoured it all. It didn't want me to leave. It didn't want anyone to know I was here. I was nourishment. I don't know how long it's been. Days, weeks, time slips here. My watch cracked when the walls pressed against my wrist. I can't tell if it's snowing outside anymore, or if there's even an outside left. Sometimes I hear scratching in the walls again. Sometimes I hear breathing that isn't mine. Sometimes I wake up with bite marks on my arms and legs, small, precise, like the house is tasting me. I've stopped fighting. I write these words not for escape, but to remember. Because the worst part isn't the isolation, or the shrinking walls, or the flesh under the floor. It's the fact that I'm starting to feel comfortable. I'm starting to like it here. And soon, when someone else rents this cabin, when they find the online listing that says peaceful, perfect solitude, I'll be waiting in the walls, whispering to it, just like the house whispered to me. I never wanted to be alone again after my wife died, but grief makes you do strange things. You run, you hide, you search for places where the noise of the world can't reach you. That's why I rented the cabin, miles away from any town, tucked between icy hills and surrounded by silent, snow-drenched trees. The listing said it was a healing retreat, secluded, peaceful. They left out haunted. The first night felt hollow. I walked through the rooms, her scent still faint on the scarf I kept in my pocket. Every creak of the wood reminded me of footsteps that should have been hers. I drank too much wine, stared out at the falling snow, and cried until I passed out on the couch. When I woke up, the fireplace was. I didn't remember lighting it. I chalked it up to the wine. Maybe I'd done it and forgotten. But something felt wrong. The logs hadn't burned down at all. The flames danced too perfect, silent still, like an imitation of fire rather than fire itself. The next day, I found her picture on the nightstand, a photo of my wife, the one I'd left behind in my apartment, framed, untouched. I hadn't packed it. I stood there for a long time, staring at her face, my hands shaking. Grief does strange things. I told myself maybe I had packed it unconsciously. Maybe I needed her with me. But in the days that followed, it wasn't just the photo. I found her scarf hanging on the coat rack, her mug in the kitchen sink, a pair of her earrings left on the bathroom counter. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if the house was playing tricks on me. Every object reappeared like a breadcrumb in a maze, leading me somewhere I didn't understand. And every time I found something of hers, I heard that fire crackling, always lit, always glowing, even if I doused it hours earlier. Then came the footsteps upstairs, software, deliberate. They started around midnight. I'd sit on the couch and hear slow, steady pacing above me, as if someone were walking back and forth in the empty guest room. I refused to go up at first. I just sat there, gripping the wine glass tighter, convincing myself it was the wind or an old house settling. But it wasn't the wind. I know that now. Because on the fifth night, I heard the footsteps descend the stairs. That was the first time I saw her. Not in full, not yet. Just a silhouette by the hallway mirror, a blurred shape standing still, as if watching me from the shadows. I called out her name, voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just stepped back into the darkness and vanished. That night, I dreamt of her lying in bed beside me, whispering my name, cold fingers tracing my cheek. When I woke up, there were frost prints on the sheets, the imprint of a body, curled beside mine. I should have left, but part of me didn't want to. Part of me needed her back, even if it wasn't real. I started talking to her, saying good morning, good night, leaving notes by the fireplace. I knew how insane it was, but I didn't care. For a while, I could pretend. I could pretend she was still here, still alive, still part of my days. But then she started answering, not in words, in gestures. The wine poured itself. The radio turned on with our favorite song. The bed made it. Her handwriting appeared in my journal. Things I never wrote, never could have written. Stay here with me. Let go of the pain. Let me. And I did. Slowly. I gave myself to the illusion. Let her presence wrap around me, a warm blanket in the dead of winter. But something was wearing her face, but it wasn't. The things it said in my sleep turned darker. I'd wake with bruises on my arms, deep scratches on my back. I'd find candles lit in rooms I hadn't entered. My reflection in the mirror began to warp, sometimes smiling when I wasn't. Sometimes it wasn't even me looking back anymore. One night I woke to find her standing over me. Her eyes were black pits. Her smile stretched unnaturally wide. She leaned close and whispered in a voice that was hers, but hollowed out, "You're mine now." And when I tried to leave the next morning, the car wouldn't start. The tires were shredded. The phone had no signal. The snow had piled so high against the door that I could barely push it open. And beyond it, just white. No road, no trees, no sky. Just an endless wall of snow and silence. The cabin was no longer just a place. It was a trap, a tomb, a womb maybe, where something had grown, fed on my sorrow, taken her shape, and now refused to let me go. Every night it lies beside me. Every morning I wake with less of myself than before. I see her in every corner. I hear her breathing in the walls. And now, sometimes I forget her name, forget my name. But the fire always burns, the scarf always smells like, the wine is always full, and the voice in my head says, "You were never meant to leave." Maybe I won't. Maybe I already didn't. Maybe this story is being written by whatever's left of before I forget the world completely, before I become part of this house, just like she did. I moved into the winter rental thinking I'd finally found peace. It was a sleek, modern home nestled deep in a snowy mountain valley, big windows, heated floors, smart technology, all wrapped in beautiful minimalism. It was the kind of place that looked straight out of a design magazine. Remote, quiet, untouched by the chaos of city life. Exactly what I needed after my burnout. I was a digital animator by trade. Deadlines, pressure, constant Zoom calls. It all started to blur until my doctor forced me to take a mental health break. This was supposed to be my reset button. Just me, some nature, and silence. But silence has its own noise. The first strange thing happened on the second day. I was brushing my teeth when I saw movement behind me in the mirror. A shadow, quick and subtle, passing behind the frosted glass door of the hallway. I turned, expecting to see something. Nothing was there. I stood still, listening, heart thudding. No creaks, no footsteps, just that eerie hush, the kind you only hear when snow blankets the world, and even time seems to slow down. I told myself it was a trick of light, maybe a tree branch outside shifting, maybe the echo of my own motion, but it kept happening. Little movement, reflection, things caught at the edge of my vision. I'd walk into a room and swear the chair had moved slightly. One morning, I found my laptop powered on, though I was certain I'd shut it the night before. I started locking the bedroom door at night. Then came the messages, not in my email, not in text, in the mirrors, written faintly in fog, just after I stepped out of the shower. At first, it was a single word, look. Then the next morning, behind you, and once, carved lightly into the condensation of the glass window near the living room, I see you too. I searched the house from top to bottom. There were no signs of a break-in, no footprints in the snow outside. Every door was locked, the security system untouched. Still, I installed more cameras, inside and out. If someone was sneaking in, I'd catch them. I didn't. But the cameras caught something else. A blur. Just that. A human-shaped blur passing through the hallway around 3:12 a.m., night after night. It was never clear, like a low-resolution image corrupted by static. It didn't walk. It drifted. Limbs slightly bent, face completely distorted. Every night it came closer. One night it was in the living room, then the kitchen. Then it was standing right outside my bedroom door, unmoving, pixelated, like a glitched character in a horror game. But when I opened the door in a panic, no one was there. I started staying awake all night, watching the feed. That's when I noticed something else. The cameras were lagging, slight shifts in timestamp, minor at first, then longer, seconds, then minutes, then full blank spaces in the recordings, where the entity should have appeared but didn't. But those minutes were missing from my memory too. I'd wake up in places I didn't fall asleep, on the couch, in the hallway, once even kneeling by the front door with no recollection of getting there. My journal had entries I didn't write, scribbled lines, drawings of warped faces, written over and over again. I'm not alone in here. It's watching me through my eyes. Don't trust the mirrors. I tried to call for help. No signal. Landline dead. Internet went offline that night and never came back. I smashed every camera, turned off every device, covered every reflective surface with sheets and towels. But I could still feel it, watching. It wasn't a person. I know that now. It was something else entirely. Some presence that existed only when it was unseen. Something that thrived in the periphery, just outside focus, like an old memory or a flicker in a dream. It fed on attention, on paranoia, on the act of watching itself. The more I feared it, the clearer it became. I tried to leave the house, but it had changed. The door opened to more hallways, endless, twisting passages of white walls and frosted glass, reflecting hundreds of warped versions of myself. I ran for what felt like hours before I realized I hadn't left at all. I was still inside, still watched, and now even my own reflection doesn't follow my movements. It moves slower, stares longer, smiles when I don't. I write this now in a room I don't recognize, one that wasn't in the original floor plan. There's no door, no windows, just screens on every wall showing security footage from places I haven't been. I'm not sure where I am or who I am, but I know this. The thing in the mirrors, it's learning to mimic me, and soon it won't need me at all. It'll step out of the glass and take my place, and no one will ever know I was replaced because it watches better than I ever could, and it's already smiling. It started with a leak, a slow, steady drip from the ceiling in the corner of the living room. I noticed it on a quiet winter evening, just a few days after I moved into the old rental house. It was an aging place, but it had charm. High-beamed ceilings, antique furniture, and a fireplace that filled the whole room with warmth on snow-bitten nights. But that leak, it never stopped. I checked the attic above the ceiling. No pipes, no water stain, nothing. Just an empty, dusty space filled with insulation and forgotten furniture. Still, the water kept dripping, collecting into a small, dark puddle on the hardwood floor. The stain that formed beneath it wasn't like normal water damage. It was darker, greasy, almost black, and it smelled faintly metallic, like rust and old meat. I mopped it, scrubbed it. It came back, always in the same shape, a strange, uneven oval that reminded me of an open mouth. I even joked about it in a text to a friend. House is leaking from the ceiling. Might be haunted. Lol. I shouldn't have. Because by the third night, the dripping turned into whispering. Not loud, just faint, like someone whispering through water. I couldn't make out the words at first. It sounded like a woman's voice, speaking from inside the walls, soft and desperate. I pressed my ear against the ceiling, and I heard it clearly. "Let me out!" I leapt back, heart hammering. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers continued, growing louder with every hour past midnight. The stain grew wider. It began to spread across the ceiling like veins, long branching cracks that looked too organic to be from water damage. And then came the footsteps, heavy one, dragging, slow, from above. I knew the attic was empty. I knew it. Still, I climbed the creaking ladder the next morning and opened the hatch, flashlight in hand, pulse thudding like a war drum. Something was wrong with the floorboard. They were soft, beneath the insulation, as if rotted from inside. I pulled some of it back, and that's when I found the trap door, a square hatch I hadn't seen before, nailed shut, concealed under layers of dust and debris. There was something beneath the attic, a space that wasn't on the blueprints, a hidden crawl space. I should have left then, but I didn't. I pried open the hatch. The air that came out was heavy and wet. It smelled like decay, thick and damp, like something buried too long in soil. I pointed my flashlight inside and saw the rocking chair, an old wooden rocker in the center of the small square room. Nothing else, just that chair, sitting on warped floorboards, gently swaying back and forth. Even though there was no draft, I didn't step down. I just stared, and the longer I stared, the more it moved, faster, sharper, until it slammed against the floor so violently it cracked a leg. I slammed the hatch shut and nailed it closed, but I couldn't unsee it. That night, the stain on the ceiling bled through completely. It wasn't water anymore. It was something darker, something alive. It began to drip down the walls like black ink, staining the wallpaper, pulsing like veins beneath skin, and the whispers became screams. "Let me out! Let me out!" The whole house groaned with the weight of something pushing from within the walls, like it was trying to birth itself through the ceiling. And then I heard it again, the rocking. But this time, it wasn't in the attic. It was downstairs, in the living room. I ran down with a flashlight, trembling, and there it was. The same old rocking chair, sitting in the corner of the room, slowly moving, creaking, soaked with dark moisture. I didn't bring it down. I never touched it. But it was there. And on the seat, something had been carved into the wood with long, jagged scratches. She waits below. I tried to leave the house that night, but the doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. The walls groaned and shifted, sealing themselves in like a rib cage around a beating heart. I was trapped inside with it, with her. I don't know who she was. I don't know what she wanted, but I saw her the next night. She crawled down from the ceiling like wet roots, a shriveled figure, limbs too long, face wrapped in gauze, teeth blackened and crooked. Her mouth didn't move when she screamed. The sound came from inside me, from my own throat. She sat in the rocking chair and stared at me all night. Now, I sit across from her every evening. I can't move. I can't speak. I can't even look away. Because if I do, she starts to rock again. And I know one day soon she'll get up, and I'll be the one in the chair next, and someone else will move into this house and hear the leak and find the stain and hear the whispers, just like I did. Because the house needs someone to watch her now. It wasn't my idea to house sit. It was my cousin Leo's. He was headed overseas for 3 months, and his cabin in the northern woods needed someone to keep the pipes from freezing and the generator running during the brutal winter. I was between jobs, exhausted from city life, and in desperate need of solitude. The timing was perfect. He handed me the keys, showed me the backup systems, gave me the Wi-Fi password, and left with a grin. Just don't go crazy out there, all right? At first, it was peaceful. The isolation was heavy in the best way. The snowstorm had blanketed the world in silence, and I spent days wrapped in blankets, reading books by the fireplace, sipping coffee, while frost crept along the windows. But within the first week, I started feeling off. Not afraid, not yet, just unsettled. The cabin wasn't big. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, an open kitchen living space. Nothing extravagant, but it felt bigger when you were alone in it. Some nights, I'd hear sounds from the opposite end, muffled thumps, creaks, the groan of old wood, normal in an old house. But some of those sounds weren't structural. Some sounded like breathing. Once, while brushing my teeth, I heard a whisper behind me, so faint it could have been in my head. "Who are you?" I spun around. Nothing. Just the hallway and the hum of the heater. I laughed nervously, but the chill running down my back lingered for hours. Things escalated on the 11th night. I woke up at 2:46 a.m. to footsteps in the kitchen. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I lay in bed frozen, trying to rationalize. Maybe ice was sliding off the roof. Maybe something fell. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping across the floor. I grabbed the flashlight and tiptoed out of bed. The kitchen was empty, but the chair at the table had moved, just a few inches, turned slightly toward the hallway, like someone had sat down and was now watching me. I didn't sleep again that. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow on the porch, bare feet, human, leading from the woods to the door, but none leading away. I called Leo. His voice was calm but distant. Sometimes the place plays tricks. The silence can get inside your head. I asked if he'd ever seen anything. He hesitated. Then he said, "Just keep the door locked. You'll be fine." That night, I triple locked the doors, checked every window, made sure every curtain was closed. But when I woke up at 3 a.m., the front door was wide open. Snow had blown in across the floor, and a single trail of wet footprints led from the doorway directly to my bedroom. I wanted to run, but the storm had worsened. Roads were buried. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The power flickered and died before sunrise. The generator didn't start. I spent that day in a daze, shivering beside the fireplace, thinking I'd hallucinated the whole thing. But then I found the journal. It was in the bedroom closet, tucked behind some old linens, handwritten, dozens of entries, all in Leo's handwriting. Except not all of it was his tone. It started as typical daily entries, weather updates, to-do lists, grocery reminders. Then, gradually, they devolved into paranoia. The man is back again. He stands behind the window at night. Sometimes I see him inside the mirror. He's always smiling, but he has my eyes. I watched myself walk past the hallway last, but I was still sitting in the chair. I don't know which one of us is real anymore. The last page simply read, "I left, but I think he stayed behind." That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every mirror in the cabin was covered. Every door was bolted, but I still heard footsteps in the hallway. I saw shadows pacing outside the window, even though no one could have made it through the snow. I began catching glimpses of a figure from the corner of my eye, always out of focus, always just beyond reach. And then I started seeing myself. Reflections in dark windows showed me standing behind myself. Movements that didn't match mine. Smiles that lasted a second too long. Sometimes the cabin's old mirror, the one I had covered, was uncovered when I woke, and my reflection would stare at me, even when I turned away. I tried to leave. I packed my things, pushed my car through the snow, and drove through the storm until I reached the main road. But no matter how far I drove, the road always circled back to the cabin. Over and over, hours passed, the same sign, the same curve, the same cabin appearing again through the trees. I realized something terrible then. I never left. I don't think I ever really could. Now, I sit in the same chair by the fireplace, listening to footsteps in the hallway. I don't cover the mirrors, because whatever lives in them already walks. And when Leo returns, he won't notice that. He'll see me. He'll hear me laugh. He'll think I'm fine. But he'll never realize the real me is still inside screaming silently through reflection. And the one wearing my smile has just started. I thought I'd finally found peace when I moved into the cabin. After everything that happened, after the accident, the trial, the media storm, I just wanted to disappear. The court cleared me. Everyone said it wasn't my fault. But that didn't stop the whispers, the glares, the hate. Not when it was a child. Not when people needed someone to blame. So I packed what little I had left and headed north. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend. Tucked deep into a snow-covered woodland, no neighbors, no cell reception. Just a satellite phone in case of emergency. The perfect place to disappear. It was beautiful, quiet in a way the city never was. The trees bowed under the weight of snow, and the air was so cold it stung my lungs. I chopped wood, made fires, read, cooked simple meals, and for a few days, it actually worked. I felt normal, until the footprints started. It was early morning when I first noticed them. Small tracks in the snow, like those of a barefoot child, winding from the woods to the front steps of the cabin. I stood there, staring down at them with a sick feeling rising in my chest. I told myself they must have been left the night before, maybe a stray hiker or an animal that somehow left strange tracks, but they didn't lead away, only toward the house. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching, waiting. Snow fell steadily, covering everything. By morning, the prints had vanished beneath a fresh layer of white. I tried to forget, but the next night the power went out. I lit candles and built a fire, trying to keep my nerves from unraveling. But just past midnight, I heard the soft creak of floorboards. light, delicate steps, like those of a child walking barefoot across old wood. I froze. They were coming from the hallway. I picked up my flashlight, heart hammering, and stepped slowly toward the sound. The hallway was empty. The guest bedroom door was cracked open. I hadn't opened that door since I arrived. I pushed it open. The bed was untouched, covered in a thin film of dust, but there on the far wall was a handprint, small and smudged, in something dark, too dark to be dust. I reached out and touched it. It was wet. That night I dreamed of the accident again, only it was different this time. In the dream, I wasn't driving. I was standing in the road, watching. The headlights bore down on me, blinding, deafening, but I didn't move. I just stood there, and I saw her, standing right behind me, a little girl with wet hair, pale skin, and empty eyes. She didn't speak. She just stared. When I woke, I was freezing. The fire had gone out. My breath hung in the air. But worse, the front door was open again, just like it had been in the dream. Snow had blown in across the floor, and in the middle of it, more footprints. I tried to convince myself I was losing my mind, that the isolation was warping my thoughts, stirring old guilt. But each night she came back. I never saw her fully. Only shadows at the edges of the room, reflections that didn't belong to me, the sound of laughter that echoed faintly through the vents. Sometimes I'd find the candles already lit when I returned from outside, or the chairs moved slightly, or my boots soaked with melting snow even though I hadn't worn them. But the worst was the music box. I found it in the attic. I don't know why I went. I just felt compelled. It was buried beneath a blanket in an old wooden chest. When I opened it, the melody played softly, delicate and broken. And inside was a single photograph. A young girl standing in front of the cabin. No date, no name. Just her. The same girl from my dreams. I didn't recognize. I didn't know who she was. But when I tried to throw the music box away, it returned to the shelf by my bed the next, and the melody would play at night on its own, low and slow, as if underwater. I stopped sleeping altogether. My eyes burned. My skin felt raw. I stopped eating, too afraid to close my eyes or turn my back on the hallway, because she was getting bolder. One night, I caught a glimpse of her in the mirror, just a flash. But it was her, standing right behind me, her head tilted slightly, her eyes impossibly wide. Another night, I found her drawing on the walls, small scribbles etched in what looked like charcoal. Shapes I didn't understand. Circles with slashes, crosses inside spirals, and always a figure with black eyes. She wanted something. I started hearing her, not whispers now, clear, cold. "Why did you leave me?" I tried to answer. I screamed into the empty air. I begged her to leave, but the guilt weighed heavier. I kept remembering things I didn't want to, how I'd been distracted behind the wheel, how I hadn't seen the kids step into the road until it was too late, how I never even got out of the car after, how I just drove off. That was the truth, wasn't it? The court didn't know that part. No one did, but she did. The child I hit hadn't been her, but she didn't care. She just wanted someone to suffer, and now she has me. The last time I tried to leave, I got lost in the woods, only a mile from the house, but somehow I walked in circles for hours. And when I finally made it back, the cabin wasn't there. Just a burned-out husk, blackened and collapsed. But when I opened the door, everything was still intact. The fireplace burning, the music box playing, the little girl's laughter echoing from upstairs. I don't know what's real anymore. Maybe this place is a prison for people like me, those with guilt too heavy to escape. Maybe she finds us. Maybe she builds these cabins like traps, like spider webs in the snow. All I know is that I'm never leaving, even when I try. Even if someone finds this journal and comes looking for me, they won't find me. They'll only find the cabin, and they'll hear the music box. And soon, she'll have someone new to haunt, because she never forgets, she never forgives, and she never lets you go. It was the coldest winter in years, and I was stuck alone in my apartment while my roommate visited family for the holidays. Normally, I liked the solitude. I'd been looking forward to a few quiet weeks of binge-watching shows, ordering takeout, and just decompressing. But from the moment she left, the apartment didn't feel right anymore. It wasn't anything big at first, just a feeling, like something invisible was always a few steps behind me. I thought maybe I was just feeling the weight of isolation, the strange kind that creeps in when you haven't spoken to another person in days. Then, I started hearing things. At night, the pipes would groan louder than usual, but sometimes it wasn't the pipes. I'd hear soft shuffling outside my bedroom door. Not footsteps exactly, more like something brushing slowly against the floor. I'd sit up in bed and listen, my heart racing, but it would always stop before I could build up the nerve to open the door. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, but then the refrigerator started opening on its own. I'd hear the rubber seal break, the quiet hum of it swinging open. I'd walk into the kitchen and find the door wide open. sometimes with food rearranged inside. Nothing missing, just moved. The milk on the bottom shelf, when I clearly remembered placing it on top. A jar of pickles open, but untouched. The silverware drawer left slightly ajar. One morning, I woke up to find all the cabinets open, every single one. I stood there in the cold kitchen, shivering, just staring at the gaping doors. I didn't know what scared me more, that someone was in the apartment with me, or that something. I started locking my bedroom door at night. It didn't help. A few nights later, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. It was heavy and slow, coming from just outside my door. I froze in bed, too terrified to move. Then something pressed against the door. Not a knock, a slow, steady pressure, like someone was resting their forehead against the wood. I could hear it creaking. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. I just waited. Eventually, it stopped. The next morning, there was a dark smudge on the outside of my bedroom door, like oil or dirt or blood. I don't know. I cleaned it without thinking, like if I erased it fast enough, it would somehow undo the night before. I tried calling my roommate. No answer. Her phone kept going straight to voicemail. I even checked her social media to make sure she was okay. Nothing had been posted in days. That's when the dreams started. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, unable to remember what I'd seen, only that I woke up feeling watched, and not just during sleep. Even during the day, I felt eyes on me. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and feel a rush of static like I'd interrupted something I couldn't see. Then I found the note. It was slid under my door one night. No envelope, just a piece of crumpled paper, folded neatly. No handwriting, just block letters, printed in thick ink. Stop locking the door. She can't get in when you do. I dropped it and ran out of the apartment that night. I stayed at a friend's place for a few days, trying to convince myself I was just having a breakdown. Maybe the loneliness was doing things to my head. Maybe I was unraveling. But when I came back to get some clothes, something was waiting for me. Everything in my room had been rearranged, not just moved around, rearranged exactly the way my roommate kept it when she lived there alone, before I ever moved in. Her favorite blanket was folded on the couch. Her shoes were lined up perfectly by the door. Her perfume bottle, one she hadn't used in months, was open on the dresser. I called her again. This time, someone picked up, but it wasn't her. It was breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate breathing. And then a whisper so faint I almost didn't hear it. She's not coming back. I hung up, shaking. I moved out that night. I don't know what I lived with during those weeks alone. I don't know what it wanted or why it mimicked her habits like that. I don't know who or what left that note under my door. All I know is I still get mail addressed to her, and I still hear breathing when I sleep, even in my new place, even when I'm not alone, even now. I don't tell people this story anymore, not because I've forgotten it, but because no one ever believes me. They say I was dreaming or hallucinating, or that the isolation of winter got to me, but I know what happened then. I remember it in terrifying detail. It was a brutal winter. The roads were icy, the snow never seemed to stop falling, and power outages were happening all over the region. I was living in a small rental cabin just outside a remote mountain town, something I'd always wanted to try. Peace and quiet, fresh air, space to breathe. I didn't expect to be trapped there. On the fourth night, a storm knocked out the power. The house went completely dark. No electricity, no heat, no phone service. My car wouldn't start either. The battery had died earlier that day, and with no town nearby, I was completely cut off. I bundled up in layers and lit every candle I had. The flickering flames made the house feel even more eerie. Shadows danced on the walls, long and twisted, like fingers stretching across the room. I tried to distract myself with books, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept hearing tapping on the windows. At first, I thought it was branches, but there were no trees close enough to reach the glass. The tapping was deliberate, slow, spaced out, like someone using a single knuckle. I checked outside twice, but saw nothing except white snow piled high and darkness beyond the edge of my porch. That night, I slept restless. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. I froze, barely breathing. The steps circled the house once, twice, then stopped right outside my bedroom window. I stayed perfectly still, heart thundering in my ears. There was no knock, no sound, just silence. Then a whisper. I swear to you, I heard it. A voice, raspy, broken. Just one word. Cold. I didn't sleep again after that. I stayed awake, clutching a flashlight like it was some kind of weapon, waiting for dawn. When daylight finally came, I found footprints in the snow outside. Bare feet, no shoes, no socks. Just a pair of human footprints, leading straight to the window, and none leading away. I didn't go outside that day. I couldn't. Something inside me said not to cross the threshold. I kept every door locked, every curtain shut, and sat in the corner of the living room with my back to the wall. That night I heard it again. The whisper. Let me in! Then came the knocking. Slow, measured. 3 heavy knocks on the front door. I didn't move. Then 3 knocks on the back door. Then 3 on the kitchen window. The whispers became more frequent, sometimes just words, sometimes a humming noise that made my skin crawl. Once, I heard what sounded like nails dragging along the wood siding outside, and all the while, the temperature inside the cabin kept dropping, as if something was pulling the warmth out of the air. On the 6th night, I broke. I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the door. Nothing was there. No footprints, no figure, just the endless white expanse of snow and the sound of wind whistling through the trees. I stood there for a moment, shaking, trying to understand what was happening. Then I heard it behind me, a soft shuffle across the floorboard. I turned around too slowly. There was something in my house, something pale, tall, almost translucent. I couldn't make out its face. It flickered like candlelight, but I could feel it watching. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, slightly tilted, like a curious animal trying to figure out what I was. I ran. I ran back into the snow without boots, without a coat, just pure terror fueling every step. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where I collapsed and waited for a car, any car, to pass by. Hours later, a plow truck driver found me half frozen, mumbling incoherently about the thing in the house. I never went back for my things. The landlord called me a month later, said no one wanted to rent the place, and the power wouldn't stay on, the pipes kept freezing, and tenants reported strange knocking sounds at night. The last renter left a note behind. Only 2 words, scrawled in the black marker on the wall above the bed. Still cold. I haven't spent a single winter alone since, and every year when the snow begins to fall and the wind howls against my window, I wonder if it ever really left me, because sometimes, on the coldest night, I still hear it. The whisper, let me in.